Hello and welcome to Daddy's Show. I always throw my arms up when I do that introduction, don't I?
You do. I did it with you then.
Yes. It's like doing a Mexican wave. Way. Hello and welcome to Daddy Issues, the podcast where we're finally allowed back into a football stadium at up to a maximum of 2,000 people thanks to Tier 2 coronavirus restrictions. And normally we talk about father and son relationships, but David Bryan, which tier are you in of the latest coronavirus restrictions?
We're in Tier 2 also.
Oh, yeah, we've done it. We've done it. I'm in a very special area of coronavirus restrictions. So, for reference, for people who listen to this in 100 years' time, it's the 5th of December 2020. Was it Tuesday?
I'm struggling.
Yeah, on Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Lockdown ended. No, it was Wednesday. On Wednesday, lockdown ended, the 2nd of December. And we've now entered the new tier system, whereby you can kind of do some stuff, unless you're in the north of England, and then you can't do shit. But I'm in a very interesting area, because the village I live in, called Temple Cloud, which is not as nice as it sounds, is located within the postcode, the borough of Bristol, right? So we're outer Bristol, really. Bristol is in Tier 3, where there's restrictions up the wazoo. It's the only area in the south of England that's in Tier 3. So we're in a Bristol postcode, but we're technically in Bath and North East Somerset is our county area. So we have a Bristol postcode, but we're like, haha, you fuckers, we're in Tier 2, even though we share the same postcode as the rest of Bristol. So just to throw it out there to my Bristol people, suck a dick. I'm in Tier 2, you sons of bitches.
You're alienating so many of our fan base right now.
Of our loyal Bristol fan base.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, Bristol people. But no, it's a crazy time. Are you relieved to be out of lockdown? Did you do anything to celebrate?
No, our lives didn't really change much in and out of lockdown. We're in Southampton on the south coast, and me and my girlfriend both work at the General Hospital. So our job situation hasn't really changed because hospitals have to keep going. And obviously there are all tight restrictions and everything. But we've kind of embraced lockdown ever since the first one. So even between these lockdowns, our lives didn't change much. Maybe we had dinner or lunch with my parents a couple of times. But, really I've kind of enjoyed being free of the obligation to go out and do stuff. And we're both doing a lot more things at home creatively and productively. So actually, besides all of the implications to the whole population health wise, I wouldn't mind if it carries on. Actually,
these restrictions, if the restrictions kept on into the new year or something.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind
to
if the government would have the balls to say, you know what, no one go anywhere. I know it's Christmas and we should be afraid of pissing people off, but no, you should all continue to be locked down because the pandemic isn't going to take a break for Christmas just because we want it to.
It's true. The pandemic's a Hindu. I don't know if they put that on the news yet, but it doesn't celebrate Christmas.
Well, yeah.
So
exactly.
it takes a break for the Hindu holidays, but not. I should just say that's not deliberately a Hindu joke. It could have been any religion that wasn't Christian. That was just the first one that came to my head. But yeah, it's a weird situation for sure. And to quote Kent Brockman on The Simpsons, I've said it once and I'll say it again, democracy simply doesn't work. And this is one of those clear examples, right, where everyone's so upset. Oh my God, but what are people going to say if they can't go out for Christmas? Thanks, I'm not dead would be a pretty good response.
Yeah.
But anyway, this isn't a coronavirus podcast. This week it's a Holocaust episode of the podcast.
Thank God,
so,
what a relief.
Oh, phew. So we're transitioning over to our topic for this week, which, I don't really need to introduce because it's in the title of the podcast, so anyone who's listening will know. But we are talking about Art Spiegelman's classic graphic novel, Mouse, which was my pick of something to talk about. It's the story of Art Spiegelman's father, who went through the Holocaust as a Polish Jew in the 1930s, and It's illustrated and written by Art Spiegelman based on the interviews that he did with his father about his experience of the Holocaust, using anthropomorphic art to depict Jewish people as mice, which is where we get the title of mouse, Germans, well, Nazis specifically, as cats. Polish people are depicted as pigs, and Americans are depicted as dogs. And that's kind of this idea of representation is something we'll get into throughout the podcast, because it's kind of integral to the whole point. But I brought this to Dave, and because tomorrow I'm teaching a comics class about Mouse. So if you want to come and do a comics class and pay me lots of money, then go to my Instagram, Dominic Archer Comics, and send me a message. Say, oh yeah, Dom, I'd love to learn about comics, because I'll teach you that shit, but not for free.
Nice plug.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe for free. Depends who you are. Is this the first time that you've read Mouse?
It is the first time I've read Mouse, but when you asked me, have you read Mouse, or however you phrased the question, I knew that it was a graphic novel because I'd seen it in comic shops and stuff, and judging by the title and the front cover, I assumed it was in German. I hadn't really looked into it, but yeah, I was glad to have an opportunity to read something would never have come to on my own, I don't think. And having read it, I think it's one of the best graphic novels I've ever read.
Yeah, it's heralded up there as one of the best. And it's a really interesting one because in terms of, if I'm going to get really arsey about its definition, Spiegelman didn't like it being called a graphic novel when it first came out, because he started publishing it in Raw magazine, which is like an alternative comics magazine that was very popular in the States in like the 70s and 80s. And as it was coming out, it was serialized. So it was when you read the book, it's split into different chapters, and it was published chapter by chapter as a comic would be. But it was turned a graphic novel when publishers started putting all of these chapters together into a single book to sell, and then saying, well, now it's a graphic novel. And Art Spiegelman, to begin with, was of the view, it's not a novel, right? Like, it's a graphic art, certainly, but it's published as a comic, and there's nothing novellic, I guess. There's nothing novellic about Mouse. It's my father's biographical story. So he didn't want it to be termed as a graphic novel because he didn't want it to appear as if the story was fictional. And that's a really interesting counterpoint when you come to the fact that all the characters are anthropomorphized. So he's saying it's not a novel, but it's also not completely realistic because people are depicted as animals. You know, it's a really interesting book to kind of discuss and to get into.
It's interesting that you brought up the definition of it, because as I was reading it, it kind of made me redefine what I thought a graphic novel was. I think mainly because most of the graphic novels I read are compendiums of serialized comics, and they're often sci-fi or action adventure or superheroes or anything like that. So I feel that this is probably the first graphic novel I've ever read that was truthfully grounded in reality and autobiographical in that way. And I kind of got stuck on the literal terms of graphic and novel because I felt like I was reading a book, like it was a page turner, like reading a book. And I think the fact that it's drawn in just black ink as well didn't make it seem like an entirely visual, I didn't consume it in an entirely visual way or even a semi-visual way. I was drawn into the story. So it kind of felt like a literalized graphic novel, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yeah, I definitely do. And yeah, the artistic style that Spiegelman chooses is like really influenced by wood cut comics that he was interested in. Woodcut is like a ridiculous form of making comics these days, but it's a kind of like doing a printing press kind of situation where you kind of illustrate your image, then it's carved onto wood, and then the wood is printed onto the. I'm probably wrong in trying to describe exactly how it works, but it comes up with a very unique illustrative style, and often with very few words, because you don't write the words onto wooden block, so you end up with very distinctive silent comics. But Spiegelman has kind of drawn from that lineage of woodcut comics to create this style, which is really brilliant and unique.
I shouldn't say I didn't mean to take anything away from the art style, because I loved how it was drawn. I thought it's again, that's nothing like I've ever seen before, and really brilliant in how you can draw what is essentially line drawings of mice, especially with the mice, because they are much more of the personalized characters, the individualized characters, and how you can tell them all apart. I found that very impressive.
Yeah, I should say as well, I didn't mention this to you when I sent you your copy, but we are talking about the first volume of Mouse today. I only sent you the first volume, so there is a second volume to continue on with. So this one, when it was first released, it has the subtitle "My Father Bleeds History," which is on the contents page, I think.
Yes,
and that is a fucking daddy issues subtitle for a book, if I've ever heard one before. My Father Bleeds History. Unlike how we normally do these episodes, we discussed off pod, we're not going to kind of go through the plot so much, because it almost feels kind of a little bit disrespectful to go through it as if it is a novel and try and describe a one man's life in an hour podcast, in this case. So we really want to talk about the relationship between Art Spiegelman himself and his father Vladik, who he's telling the story of in this book, and how it kind of spoke to us, and we'll go through bits of the book as we do, but as to kind of jump into it, what did you think of the way that Art depicts himself and depicts his father within the book? Do you feel like it's an honest depiction, or one that he's maneuvering for the sake of the art? I'm gonna have to refer to him as Spiegelman. Okay. So when we talk about art, we know I'm talking about the medium.
I wrote him down as Artie, because in the book Vladik, his father calls him Artie. So for me, it's Artie and Vladik. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So if we're do you think Spiegelman changes his father or himself in some way for the sake of the book, or do you think it's a relatively honest depiction that he gives across?
I felt that it was quite an honest depiction, in particular the way that Spiegelman depicts himself. I think especially in the early parts, no, maybe not especially, but by the third chapter, if this is all to be taken as a truthful depiction of his conversations and interviews with his dad, in the first couple of chapters, Artie is sat there and he's making notes about everything that his father's telling him, but after a point, he's recording it all. So when it comes to kind of how the conversation goes back and forth, I do believe how honest it all was. At least from that point on, because he had an audible thing to reference, and I feel like he probably was taking pretty vicious notes as he was going in the early days. But if the way I find Artie is not an entirely likable person. So I guess if you're writing autobiography and the character of yourself is flawed and kind of is rude and short with his own father, sometimes you kind of would lean on the side of it being truthful. He doesn't try and paint himself as what do you want to say, like a impartial narrator. He is a character in the story, and part of that story is how him and his father interact with each other. And he often, when his father starts to sort of complain about his life, and particularly his new wife who he remarried, Art often just dismisses it, tells him to stop talking about it, he's not interested in it, or just ignores it and moves and carries on with what he wants to talk about. He doesn't really engage with his father if it's not something that Artie is willing to talk about. It says at the beginning that he hasn't really visited his father very often. They're not very close, and he only really goes there to start talking about what happened to him during the war. So there's already a sense of detachment there, that he hasn't been the most present son. And you would think the way that he does it, sort of dismiss his dad when he complains about his new wife Mala, he would maybe take her side. But then when she does the same thing, neither of them are happy. When Mala complains to Artie about Vladik, he again just goes, anyway, can we just talk about what I want to talk about, please? So he is very self-involved. And to answer your question, if you're going to, the way he depicts himself as being kind of flawed and self-involved, makes me think he probably is taking a look at himself as well as his father. And I know there's a larger point later on when Art in the book actually sort of discusses how he is depicting his father, and whether he should remain true to it or whether he shouldn't.
Yeah, that specific moment is something we've discussed. We want to come back to later on, because that's a really important moment. I think you've really kind of hit the nail on the head of how I feel about his depiction of himself as flawed and self-involved, and this kind of comics autobiographical narrative as being flawed very much is part of the alternative comics tradition that the Spiegelman was a part of, along with other creators like Harvey Pekar as well, who just give across a strong sense that there is no point in doing autobiographical comics if you're going to hide the truth in some way, right? If you're talking about something from your life, but you are trying to hide certain bits, then the art is a lie. And if the art is a lie in an autobiographical book, then why did you even bother to do it in the first place, right? It's like its very concept will fall in on itself like a house of cards. And the great example in this book, actually, I think, is when we cut from the regular book of Mouse to Spiegelman's Prisoner on the Hell Planet comic, where we later on they have a bit of a falling out, Spiegelman and his father, specifically on a point that you mentioned, really, which is that Spiegelman is only there with his father because he wants something from him, and what he wants from him is to almost cash in on his father's trauma, right? He wants to better understand what his father has been through so that he can depict it and sell the book. And he's going to his father's house only to learn the story. And when his father says, "Oh, I think that's enough for today," Art says, "Okay, right, I'll see you later," and leaves the house. And when his father says, "Oh, I need your help fixing my drain pipe," Art's like, "Oh, Dad, it's so early in the morning, like, I can't be bothered, I've got other things, I've got my own things to do." But then when he needs something from him, which is his story and his experiences, he's there to use his father for his experiences. And the Prisoner on the Hell Planet comic is one an old Spiegelman comic from the 70s, I think, where he's illustrating the story of his mother's suicide.
Oh, so is Prisoner on the Hell Planet actually something written by Spiegelman outside of Mouse?
Yes, oh. Yeah. So that's one of his old comics that he's put in for reference within this one.
Okay.
About his mother's suicide. And the I think it's like, it was like 10 years before Mouse, this book came out. And the artistic style is completely different.
Yeah.
But again, in this book, in this comic, Prisoner from the Hell Planet, he depicts his mother's suicide as being tragic for him.
Yeah.
Right? It's like his mother killed himself, and then the last panel of the comic is him shouted, "You murdered me, Mum." Well, in this case, he says, "You murdered me, Mummy," because it's a very I don't know. There's a lot going on in that.
There's lots to unpack in that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's an incredible comic, but yeah, again, it's not about how tragic it is that his mother died. It's about how tragic it is for him that his mother died, and it's that same kind of depiction of self, that I think's kind of brutally.
It is
honest.
brutal, yeah, because he's dressed in like prison stripes the entire time. Like, it follows the story from when his mother killed herself to like finding, trying to console his dad and seeing a therapist and the funeral and all of that, and the whole time he's in prison stripes.
Yeah, and how his life has become a prison of itself. Because at this point, I think he even mentions in the comic, Spiegelman had just come out from treatment for a nervous breakdown. Then he comes out for the treatments for his own mental health issues, only to come back to his mother who has killed herself.
Yeah.
And there's a really great bit where it's a friend of the family found me out in the hall, and Spiegelman's crying, and this friend leans over and says, "Now you cry. Better you cried when your mother was still alive." And it's
that's harsh.
It is harsh. But then, as you're saying, the depictions of himself in the prison uniform correspond with his father's experience as a prisoner of war, as a captive of the Germans themselves, and then later on, the introduction of Auschwitz and concentration camps like that. And even this comic from 1972, there's a bit where he's listing the reasons for why his mother killed herself. And there's a big bit that says Hitler did it.
Yeah.
Across the panel.
Hitler did it. Menopausal depression. Like, yeah, trying to find reason behind something that could be completely without it.
Yeah, it's a really again, brutally honest depiction of that experience. But you've got some notes that you've made on the book themselves.
Yeah.
So should we can kind of work our way through your notes and the topics that you've made to bring up, if you like.
I don't know really. Like, my notes are often just to help me keep track of the story and the arcs between the characters. So, if we're talking about that specifically around his mother's suicide, it starts quite. They sort of start building that character arc of Artie's mum, Anya, right from the beginning of sort of Vladak's story of how, what happened to them during the war, with her depression, the postpartum depression that she had after Artie's older brother, who didn't make it out of the war as a child, after he was born. And it's just kind of a strange, I don't know if I'm just picking up on it now more in this time in my life, but I thought it was interesting considering when this was written and published, the depictions and the representation of depression in this book, because we do follow the sort of a recurrence in Anya throughout the experience during the war, which you could have expected just because they're in the middle of a war and they're Jews under the boot of the Nazis.
Yeah.
But her depressive states do sort of return, and we know from the beginning of the book, in the present day, quote unquote present day, that she did end up killing herself. But she's put in a sanitarium right at the beginning, which is a kind of a strange term to even come across these days. And this seems to be the sort of time where if women were seen to be hysterical, then that was kind of the diagnosis. It's hysteria. It's just something that women get because they're weak and emotional. But to put that in here kind of seemed to be topical for the time. But then Vladik, towards the end of the story, towards the end of the book, he brings up his own experience of depression and an action that he took, which he regrets to this day and really pisses Artie off. Should we? Does it matter if we're jumping all around the story?
No, again, yeah, we're not going through through the plot necessarily.
Okay.
But I think actually it's kind of good to bring up the arc of Artie and Vladik and their relationship themselves, because as we said, this is volume 1 we're talking about, and the very end of the book is in a way is a novel, follows a novel story arc. There's a reason that this is the defining moment at the end of part 1 of the book, because like a movie, it's a hard emotional moment. It's kind of almost an end of Act 2 kind of moment, right? But we start off the book, as we were saying before, where Spiegelman is only really interested in his father as far as he can get access to the trauma and to his father's story, so he can illustrate it and sell it as a comic. Right? His interest in his father and his father's life doesn't really go much further than that. He finds that his father is a nuisance. General topics of conversation annoy him. Things his father cares about annoy him. His relationship with his stepmom, he finds to be a nuisance. But over the course of the book, and in really understanding his father's story and what his father went through, the two of them do become closer, noticeably closer. Their relationship improves the more that they understand each other. And the reason that the Prisoner on the Hell Planet comic comes up is because his father, Vladik, finds this comic, or he finds a copy of it, and is like, what the fuck is this? In a way, where it's kind of like, what is this illustrated version of your mother's suicide?
Yeah, he'd never read it before until he just stumbles across it amongst all of the crap that he's hoarded throughout the years.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful moment, because Spiegelman expects his father to be angry about it, but instead they bond over that trauma of losing his mother, which for a moment this seems to be the first time. Like, they clearly both miss Anya, his mother, and Vladik's wife, but if the topic comes up, it's just, oh, what was your life like with Mum? Right? It's not, how did you process when she died? Or, what did we do to console each other when she died? It was like, they kind of just separated themselves. But in reading, when Vladik reads that comic, he begins to understand his son, and his son has begun to understand his father through learning more about his life and his experiences in the Holocaust. So at the end of the book, we've reached a point where Vladik has said, I can't find your mother's old diaries from during that time. It's the Spiegelman's like, I have to read the diaries. I have to read them because they'll tell Mum's side of the story. And I'll let you go from your notes because you have a clear idea of what you want to explore.
Yeah, well, only that, as I was saying about the honesty around his parents' depression at various times. Anya had written diaries apparently during the war, but they got lost. They never made it out. But she did write more diaries after they escaped, which, like you say, Art is really interested in reading because it'd be great for his book. Again, it'd be great for me. I've got to have them. He says it a lot of times, like, oh, I need those. I've got to see them. And it's towards the end of the book where he brings it up for a third or fourth time to his dad, and his dad says the same thing. Oh, I've tried to look, but I can't find them. And eventually he kind of caves in and says, okay, I destroyed them. What does he say about, like, I was having a particularly bad day and I burned them. And Artie explodes, And we hear that word again, which I hadn't picked up on actually in The Prisoner on the Hell Planet. But at this moment, he explodes at his dad and calls him a murderer. And which I thought was very dramatic at the time I was reading it. And I didn't make that connection to the comic, the Hell Planet comic. And he kind of explodes, but then quickly comes back down and apologizes, like, I'm sorry. And just like he always does when he's kind of done for the day, he's like, I need to leave. I'm just going to go. And again, like often, like, well, no, that's when Vladek says, listen, after the tragedy with your mother, I was so depressed then that, you know, I just did it, and I wish I hadn't. Well, you get the feeling that he wishes he hadn't. But again, Artie is like, well, there's nothing here for me. Bye, Dad. Sorry. He does apologize and goes, I should go. And Vladek says, why don't you stay for coffee? Which he often does after he's finished talking for the day. He's like, why don't you stay for dinner? Stay for coffee. And Artie always says, no, it's fine. I should go. And he seems to be apologetic. And then his dad's like, don't be a stranger. And he's like, yeah, okay, see you soon. And as he walks away, quietly under his breath, he repeats, murderer. And that was the end of the book, Dom.
Yeah.
And I had no idea this was going to be a volume 1 of 2. And it ended at that point. And I was like, what? Where's the rest?
Yeah, it's a really brutal moment because the book cuts between Vladek telling his story to Artie in the modern day, which was 1980, something like that, and then Spielberg's representations of the 30s and the 40s, and so the last image that we see from the 40s. In the entire first volume is the gates of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And we see the gates of Auschwitz, and then the next thing he does is call his father a murderer and then walk away. And it's like...
Yeah.
It's heavy.
In that last chapter, it really, like, the tension really amps up, and you do feel like you're coming to some kind of crescendo with, back in the early 40s with Vladek and Anya on the run and constantly finding different places to hide, and people are taking them in but not for very long, and they have to go back and forth, and they finally think they're going to escape. I think they pay someone to get them to Hungary, but one of these smugglers ends up turning them into the Gestapo, and then they get carted off to Auschwitz. And I'm thinking, Jesus, this is what's going to happen now. And all we get is the panels of the modern day of Vladek saying, they took us off the train, they sent the men one way, the women the other way. So I thought, me and your mother didn't know if we'd ever see each other again. And then it gets to Artie going, oh man, I wish I had those diaries. And then, as we've explained, and then it ends. It's like all this build up and all of this depiction of the horrors of the Holocaust, and Auschwitz is kind of the flagship of Holocaust history, and that's the word that we all always know. But then the book doesn't take us there. Does it take us there in the next one?
Yes, yeah, very much, yeah.
Okay.
But that's what I think is really, really interesting about this first volume, is that it's clearly going to be a biography of what a man's experience during the Holocaust. But the book is in no rush to get you to that point. To the point where to the bit where you know what happens in that way, right? Once they get to Auschwitz, we have a very clear historical understanding of, a well-documented understanding of what this is going to mean.
And the characters reference it in the book all the time as well. But then just in the terms that we know, like the ovens and the gas and of course, and when they mention other people that have been there, then they end that story with, and of course we didn't see them again. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that, as Spiegelman himself actually says, his father says, I don't think anybody's going to be interested in my time in Poland, like before the Germans invaded. Like all I did was have a textiles factory.
And
like
a very clingy
nobody's
girlfriend.
going to want to read that. Yeah. Nobody's going to want to read about Lucia. Yeah.
Which again,
that's not...
talking about quickly. Sorry, we're talking about Artie only being there to talk to his dad because he can get something out of it. His dad does tell him about Lucia, the girlfriend he had before he met Artie's mum, but then after the end of that, he goes, "Don't put that in your book, though." And Artie's like, well, why? And he's like, well, it wouldn't be respectful. It's not the proper thing. It's not interesting. And Artie's like, yeah, but it'd be great for the book. And he ends up promising not to put Lucia into the book, and obviously he does.
Yeah, we're reading him say that he won't put her in there. Yeah, which is, really... Yeah, God, it's just such a good book. It's just such a brilliant book.
Yeah, I mean, this was a strange thing for me to read about because, like I said earlier, I was really just engaged in the story. And as you said, we all know about the Holocaust and about Auschwitz, but I wouldn't say that I, regularly delve into it.
Mm-hmm.
So
not on a Friday night.
It's not great Friday night entertainment, but the book it was and is. Mm-hmm. But reading it through, like I kept getting taken aback because you mentioned about the anthropomorphization of the characters, but that didn't remove any of the humanity or the reality of it for me. There are moments in the book that really, like, kind of shocked me, not because I didn't know these things were happening, but you kind of go, oh shit, yeah, of course. And the most brutal one that springs to my mind is when they're talking about, I don't know if it's actually in Auschwitz or in another kind of labor camp or something, where the children have been separated from their parents and are screaming, and to stop the kids from screaming, German officers would grab them by the ankles and swing them against a wall. And I was like, shit. Like, I had to kind of pause for a moment and be like, Jesus Christ. Like, that takes you out of this being a comic or a graphic novel or mice and cats. So at that point you go, this happened.
Yeah. I'm tearing up.
Yeah.
Now, just talking, like,
it's heinous.
Fucking,
and all the references to ovens and stuff as well, like, because they never describe what happens, but your mind takes you to a visual place and you go, Jesus, like thousands upon thousands at a time into ovens. Yeah, it's whole, and maybe we sound naive talking about this as if and being shocked at how despicable it all was when we all know it happened, but this book really just brings it back to the forefront of your mind.
Yes, and this is one of the fundamental arguments about Mouse in general, is because it is a comic in comparison to a regular film, Spiegelman can depict these characters as animals in the way that he does, which you couldn't write a novel when going, and then they were mice. Yeah. And it's like, it's not the Red Wall series or something like that, this is the only medium that you could do it. Like, you couldn't really do it in an animated movie unless it was an adaptation of Mouse.
Yeah.
But one of the arguments that was made against Mouse, especially by Spiegelman's contemporaries like Harvey Pekar, was you are softening the horrific reality of the Holocaust by refusing to depict it as it was, right? You're trying to tell the truth of that reality, but by changing it and making it more accessible for people, you are presenting a false narrative, right? You're presenting a cleaner narrative because you are unwilling to show the depths of the depravity, basically. You've turned them into these animals so you can smooth the edges of the Holocaust. And I think there is an element of truth to that. But as we see with the Prisoner from the Hell Planet comic, you couldn't read 300 pages of that.
No.
Right? Like, your mind wouldn't take it. You're like, the reality of his emotion in Prisoner of the Hell Planet is so strong that it would be impossible to do. And I think one of the things this book does perfectly, like spot on, is to balance the heart-wrenching tragedy that happened whilst also being hilarious, right? We've spoken about like how horrible it all is, but the book is also really fucking funny. And because it has those comedic moments, especially most of them in the modern day, with the way that the Vladik himself acts and the way that Artie reacts to his father. Because it's presented in a way that is humorous, you really care about these characters and you engage with them emotionally, so that when the horrific stuff does happen, it hasn't smoothed the edges for me, at least. It hasn't smoothed the edges as much as it has allowed me to be in the book. Right? If I read Prisoner on a Hell Planet, the first thing I want to do is get away from it. Yeah. Right? Because it's a guttural reaction. But Mouse absorbs you into it, and then once you're trapped in the characters and the family relationship and the humor of the book, it's like, here's what happens. I don't know what you thought about that, the way that he depicts the characters in that way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think Spiegelman even says it in Mouse, where he goes to see his Artie goes to see his dad and Mala, and he brings a few early pages, and Vladik and Mala kind of break an argument which they're always having, called the kind of sandwich an argument. In between that, with them looking at Artie's pages, and they both agree that this is an important thing, and the character of Mala says it's an important book. People who don't usually read such stories will be interested. So it's exactly like what you said. Like, you might not want to read 300 pages of very visceral, lifelike, black and white drawings about someone's dealing with their mother's suicide or about the Holocaust, but you do get engaged into these characters, and then you do feel compelled to read on and read on. And if, say, you hadn't really paid much attention to history, you could get through Mouse, and by the end you go, now I have an understanding about this awful period in human history that I wouldn't have done otherwise, because maybe I'm not interested in history, or it's hard to deal with, thing to read. Yeah. So yeah, in making those choices, I think Spiegelman has actually opened up this part of history to a whole wider audience that might otherwise have not paid it any attention.
Yeah, I think. God, yeah, it gets to a point where it's difficult to talk about, because the book is having such a difficult time balancing its subject matter and it being written and narrated by Spiegelman himself. Because one of the big questions is, why is art in the book at all? Right? Why are we seeing his conversations with his father as well as the flashback to, why is it not just, this is the story that my father told me, and then he tells his father's story, right? Yeah. Why do we get to see that back and forth between the present and the past?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Do you have an answer? Do you have a theory?
No. What I was gonna ask you was, how much do you think the father and son depiction enhances the rest of the book? Right? Because we're here to talk about the daddy issues element of it, obviously. But do you think that their relationship is vital to the rest of the book, or if you just removed the pages and panels of them discussing, if the book would still work in its own way?
I think it does. It certainly helps with the readability of it. Not only just to give it some context, and we could talk about, why maybe it has value to show the modern days, half of it too, like Life of Pi. I keep thinking about other examples where the film or the book is about someone being told the story of the film and the book at the end. So as well as giving it context, that helps. But then in terms of readability, and like you were saying about Prisoner on the Hell Planet, it kind of divides up the horrors of the Auschwitz with a little bit of a palate cleanser. Although what's happening with Artie and Vladik and Mala is not particularly or overly positive, it kind of just gives you a bit of a break. And instead of fearing for people's lives and being reminded of a genocide, you're instead engaging in a kind of Mike Leigh kitchen sink drama kind of thing, which is which is completely different. It's almost like telling two stories at once. So I guess you could argue that you don't need to tell two stories at once, but then I almost feel like if you removed all of the present day part of the book, I would find it harder to understand why he did them as mice and cats and pigs. Because at that point, it is just a story about people surviving Auschwitz, and you kind of almost, it's harder to engage with the characters. And I suppose, obviously, this is not super contemporary to us now. I think it was just published in 1980 or something. Although the final thing was like 1991, wasn't it? The full graphic novel. Forgive me, Spiegelman, for using the term. But
I think he's accepted it now.
Is he accepted it now?
You're right. Yeah.
So we're not so far in the future that we can't relate to how people lived 20 years ago or 40 years ago. So we're kind of drawn in. The book opens in the modern day, and you're kind of getting to know these people, and it gradually goes, we're going to talk about the Holocaust now, so if you want to come in, we're going this way. It's not like page one, bam, Nazis and stuff. So yeah, I think maybe it just is another element of I want to say softening the story, but I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. Softening it in a way that does make it palatable.
It makes it more emotionally accessible, I think.
Yes.
You don't run away from the book because it's too hard to read. It is hard to read, for sure, at points.
Yeah.
But yeah, you want to be in the book. You want to keep reading.
Yeah, if anything, it adds a whole other dimension too, because we are following. We do follow Vladek and Anya during the Holocaust, and we care about them, and we're drawn into the drama of their lives, and we're also drawn into the more domestic drama of the modern day family unit. So it's kind of giving us 2 for 1.
Yeah. I think you're definitely right, and that kitchen sink element does make it all the more horrific as well, because this is just his experience that he's telling to his son while he's on the cycling machine.
Yeah.
Or they're walking to the bank and he's talking about how they were having to hide in a coal shelter or in somebody's basement, and
starving,
the husband
and sharing space with rats and
yeah. Now, while I'm here, quick, I need to take my medication, like this kind of thing, and it's all presented as so matter of fact by Vladek, because it's his life. It's not presented like a Saving Private Ryan Hollywood-esque depiction, like The Pianist, right? Where it's these big, wide, epic views of how terrible it is. It's very zoomed in, very focused. It's this man's life and this man's story that you're following, rather than
Yeah, that's interesting.
You
say it like that, because I was just thinking about the part in the book where I think it's one of the last times, if not the last time, that Artie goes round to see his dad to talk about his story, and he first sees Mala, his stepmom, crying at the table, and they start talking about Vladek, and talking about how stingy he is.
Yeah.
And
we should say, when we're talking about this part of the book, it's using Spiegelman's words that we're bringing, where he's talking about his father.
Yeah. So Mala's giving him stories about how, like, when they first got married, she needed more clothes, and instead of buying her new clothes, Vladek was like, "Well, here's my dead wife's wardrobe. You can just have all that." And she was like, "I'm not going to wear your dead wife's clothes," and he can't understand why. And I think Mala says, like, sometimes I think he only married me because I'm the same size as Anya, and so therefore he wouldn't have to buy her any more stuff. And Artie kind of empathizes and sympathizes with her. It says that, well, he always was kind of pragmatic. She laughs at the word pragmatic. It's like, no, he's just cheap. But Artie poses the question, like, I've often wondered, because he's always been this way, I've often wondered if it was the war that made him this way. or not. And Mala says, we had friends who made it through Auschwitz. And
yeah, she says, I went to the camps.
Yeah,
and
she was
I
there
didn't end
too.
up. Yeah, I didn't end up like him.
Yeah, she didn't end up like him, and they have friends who went through the same thing. But she said there was only one Vladik. So, in terms of what you were saying about whether this represents the wider story of the Auschwitz or the wider story of Polish Jews or the wider story of Jewish immigrants to the United States, they do kind of make a point of going, this is about one guy. And this is where Artie kind of gets a little bit torn about his depiction of his dad and about whether his dad seems like a racist caricature of a miserly Jew. I think
he says a miserly, in some ways he's just the racist caricature of a miserly old Jew. And his stepmom says, "Ha, you could say that again."
Yeah.
Right, and it's like, that seems to be, and then the next thing Artie says is, "I'm trying to portray my father accurately," right? And it's this constant balance. And that's one of the things that I found really interesting, actually, is the way he portrays his father in the past is much more generous than the way he portrays him in the present. And granted, that's because he's going through his father's own depiction of what his life was like, right? So he's using his father's own words to portray himself in that way. But you never see a moment where he really criticizes his father as he was in Poland before the Holocaust. It's only the man that he has become now and the man that Artie knows, rather than whoever he was before the camps, who was essentially a different person, right? Was a man with money, with a loving family, with a different son, with community that was all lost and wiped away. And so you do get two different depictions of Vladik. One of them is this person he's trying to show is not a racist caricature, whilst also having to present him as the man that he is. And then, that who he was before he lost everything. All those years ago. Yeah,
because during the Holocaust, Vladik has to make all of these choices. And they, just because then the nature of the world they were living in, they often resulted in family being taken away, friends being taken away, people dying, not because as a direct result of his choices, it's because it was going to happen. But it's always he's often the proactive force. There are moments where he goes in and out of work camps, and there's a time when he's out of them, and him and Anya are living with Anya's parents, who are very well off. They're still restricted in what they can buy and everything, but they're at least all together, and they're talking about their businesses are being taken away from them, and Vladik's really panicking about money and what they're going to do, and the rest of the family are just like, well, let's just stay here and play cards. So he takes the proactive stance of trying to get around the Nazis and starts dealing with other Jews in the black market, like without the food coupons and rations that they've all been given. So it's always him pulling them along and narrowly avoiding disaster, but those margins get narrower and narrower when, Anya's parents eventually get taken away and her grandparents, and they have to send their own son away to protect him, and then he doesn't make it either. So but he never, at no point during the story of during the war does Vladik break down. He never really seems to, the weight of everything never really shows on him. Everything he's doing.
Yeah, there's the only moment where that does happen is when some people that he was trading with are caught and hanged. And he says he didn't leave the house for 3 days or something like that afterwards.
Because he was afraid the same thing would happen to him. That's another one of those moments that it happens before the really brutal moment that I mentioned earlier about the kids being smashed against the wall. But this is kind of a lot of
it's like the introduction to what's to come.
Yeah, it just reminds you of where you are, because it's kind of, it doesn't have the pacing of kind of like an adventure story. It's not exciting. even though they are on the run, they are ducking and dodging the Nazis. It is kind of a slow burn. It's not really an adrenaline fueled thing, but you are just following the Jew characters and the families centrally. But then, it's just a bit of a reminder of, oh yeah, by the way, outside of the family, people are getting hung, people are being taken away, and but I've only just this particular few panels really made me think of the film that I mentioned to you that I've watched recently, Jojo Rabbit. And if anyone doesn't know, Jojo Rabbit is a film from a year or two ago by Taika Waititi that's set during Germany during the Second World War and follows a young boy who is very enthusiastically part of the Hitler Youth, but gradually starts to see that this is not the kind of they aren't the good guys, essentially. But being a Taika Waititi film, it is quite light-hearted, and I found it very, very funny, the way it takes the mick out of the Nazis and everything, but then it does show a fairly accurate depiction of life under Nazi rule in Germany. And there, I won't spoil it for anyone, but there is a moment where one of the principal characters ends up in just like these panels, and particularly these panels of people being hung, and all you can see is their feet. And that this character is identified only by their shoes, because we've seen them wearing those particular shoes the whole time. And you've been watching this film, you've been laughing, people are being silly, there's very amusing characters.
Isn't Hitler fun to laugh at?
To laugh at, yeah. And Taika Waititi plays the imaginary best friend of the main boy in it, who is Hitler, and his depiction of Hitler is very funny. And there's a bit of a romance subplot, and then bam, it hits you. Someone has been hung. This is a main character, and suddenly you're reminded, oh yeah, we're dealing with Nazis here. Oh yeah, we're dealing with the Holocaust here, and it completely just takes your feet out from under you. And this scene is in the book not quite as affecting, because none of the people that are being hung are characters we know, but again, it's just that sudden reminder of the consequences and the stakes here.
Yeah, I think this kind of leads us over to something that, again, I mentioned off pod and wanted to bring up slightly, which was the documentary The Problem with Apu, which was the documentary about how the Simpsons character of Apu had affected Indian Americans who were raised with this being essentially the predominant Indian character on television. And they would go to school, and the insensitive racial remarks that would be made towards them would often be Apu based, because he was the cultural touchstone of what an Indian living in America was like. And so while you get comparisons to say oh well, Fat Tony being, he's an Italian-American stereotype, right? When they created Springfield, the idea was that every single character within Springfield is a stereotype of their own, right? So you have Chief Wiggum is the fat stereotyped police officer. Then Fat Tony is the stereotypical Italian-American mob boss. Groundskeeper Willie is a pretty hardcore Scottish stereotype.
Yeah.
And Apu is an Indian stereotype of an immigrant who has come over to America and is doing a working class job to get by, but has greater ambitions for their children. Obviously being voiced by Hank Azaria, a white actor. But the documentary kind of explored how this character has influenced the Indian comedian who writes and leads the documentary. And I was really interested in the documentary at the time because I wanted to understand more of how different Indian groups within America felt about it, because it's presented from the view of the person who's writing it and narrating it, and it's I wanted to have a better understanding of what it meant to different level of immigrants, because Apu is an Indian stereotype of a specific generation that moved from India to America, right? The comic who makes the documentary has not gone through the same. He's a second generation immigrant, right? So Apu isn't a stereotype of him. It's a stereotype of his parents' generation. And in reading what different Indian Americans were saying about it, younger people of the comics generation, sorry, the comedians, the narrators generation, agreed with him, right? And felt that Apu was a character that needed to be changed because it remains harmful and depicts a stereotype that no longer exists, right? And it's being voiced by a white actor, so it continues to be a racially insensitive stereotype in a time where we should be really kind of changing our view on these things. Whereas the older people that he was actually created as a stereotype for in 1988 or 1989, whenever Apu was made, felt that this was a minor inconvenience in terms of racism, right? Like Indian Americans were and minorities in America were facing a far greater racial injustice than "Thank You, Come Again," right? Like is this really the thing that you want to get hung up on? And the bit that really interested me and connects into Mouse is that they accused the person who made the documentary of being ashamed of his parents' generation. And this is something that I've spoken to a lot with Chinese people, because I've lived in China and stuff. I don't really need to get to that. But the way that Chinese people think about Chinese Americans, right? And the way that they see Chinese Americans talk about China. And those discussions would revolve around Chinese Americans. This is the way that Chinese people think about Chinese Americans, right? Is they are Chinese in so much as they like Chinese food and will wear Chinese clothes on holidays, and that's it, right? Other than that, they are ashamed. Chinese people feel that Chinese Americans are ashamed of China as a culture, right? And that's what these older Indian immigrants were saying about this documentary. Was it's not just that people were horrible to you when you were a kid. It's that you feel a sense of shame of how your parents' generation were being depicted, right? You are ashamed of the first generation because they were Indian and you are Indian American, right? You are, as a second generation, you have a different cultural backdrop to those other people, and there is a sense of shame that you attach to that form of immigration. And I don't know if that's true, right? I don't want to speak for either party, but for me, when I read Mouse, it connects to what I read about that, in the way that Artie depicts his father, because Artie Spiegelman is American, right? He's a Jewish. He's Jewish by culture, but he doesn't show himself as being religious. He doesn't seem to have any connection or knowledge of the Holocaust other than the cultural knowledge that's been passed on to him. He doesn't know his father's story. And he has a sense of shame of his father as an immigrant, right? When they talk, they don't talk in Polish, or they don't talk in Hebrew. They talk specifically in English, and Spiegelman writes in his father's broken English. He doesn't try and edit his father's English. He depicts it as he said it, which is broken and full of grammar mistakes, to highlight the fact that his father is different from him, and his father has not assimilated into America in the same way that Spiegelman is clearly a second. He's an American. He's not, a Polish. He was born in America. No, I think he was born actually in Scandinavia as his parents moved over to America after the war. But I don't know how much you feel that I don't know if that's something you picked up on in general, the way that Spiegelman is almost embarrassed by his father and how different his father is to him. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yeah. I can see that now. I didn't pick up on it at the time while reading. On reading, I really enjoyed the fact that Vladik was written in broken English, because it gave him a voice, and I read it in his voice, because the English is all muddled up and broken, and it was another way of individualizing him, because he's the only one in the modern day story that speaks that way. And I liked how, because we have grown old Vladik's voice now resonant in our minds, when we go back in time to the story of the Holocaust, everyone speaks like that because it's Vladik telling Artie the story. So I'm reading all the voices of the characters back in the 40s and 30s in Vladik's voice, because he's the one telling their story. So it almost actually kind of makes it. Maybe you could argue that puts up a bit of a barrier in really empathizing with the characters in the past, because you're not getting their own voices, or maybe people read it differently than I did. But yeah, I certainly read it in maybe quite a cinematic way, where it's almost, I'm almost reading it in voiceover with Vladik playing all the characters. But I can certainly see where you're coming from in terms of a second generation immigrants' feelings around their parents. I don't know if I got a sense that he was embarrassed of him, but we do know that Artie has not been close with his dad since he's been an adult. So he's certainly not close, and he certainly doesn't make any excuses for him.
I think this is something we see more of in the second book as well, because obviously in the second book we get more time with them in the present day as well. And there's a very specific moment, without wanting to go too much into it, because when we eventually do the second one, we'll talk about it. But there's a moment where Vladik is with Francois, which is Spiegelman's French wife. And we'll definitely get into a big discussion on her in the next one, because she only pops up in 1 or 2 pages on this one. But Francois is driving Vladik, and they see an African American on the road, and Francois stops to help, to pick. He's like a hitchhiker, so she stops to pick him up, and Vladik is racist, and it's like, well, what if he tries to rob us or something like that, right?
Yeah, because there's a bit actually in this where he mentions about Anya's boyfriend before, because we know that Vladik had a girlfriend before, but then Vladik mentions that Anya's boyfriend before was a communist, and he's like, I don't hang around with communists. So
he says she was a good girl and stopped seeing him after I like.
Yeah, because I said if the marriage is not going to happen if you continue with these are shenanigans. And she gives up on that, because she was like helping the communists sort of underhandedly. I'm not sure on the history of it, but she has to kind of secretly help the communists in Poland in the 1930s. She's like translating
documents into German.
Yeah, she's a fluent German speaker. And when she's about to get busted, so she hands all her documents off to a friend, and then she gets in the shit for it and spends like 3 months in jail to save Anya from prison. And then Anya just gives up on that life because Vladik doesn't like communists.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite. I put that bit on Instagram yesterday. Actually, on my Instagram stories, I took a picture of those 2 panels, because that was one of my distinctive memories from the first time I read this book. It's brilliantly shown, and it's the 2 of them that sat there. And panel 1 is Artie and Vladik sat across the table from each other, drinking some coffee, and Spiegelman says, about Mum, did she have any boyfriends before she met you? And Vladik replies, not romantic one, but one tall boy from Warsaw. Zoom in on the second panel. He was a communist.
Yeah, ew.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great dramatic comedic switch where it's like the worst thing this guy could possibly have been.
It's
Was
real
a
like
communist.
darkly comic though, because we're talking about
Yeah,
the Holocaust and a Jew who survived the Holocaust, and yet he has bigotry in his heart. He has
well, yeah, yeah,
hatred
yeah, yeah,
of another group just based on their lifestyle. Is that life? Is
yeah.
lifestyle the right word
Well,
for a communist? I
ideology.
don't know.
Yeah,
Ideology. Let's go with
yeah,
ideology. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I think that's really true. But it's a great, yeah, it's a great moment, and again is Spiegelman showing his father honestly, but at the same time
Yeah.
making light of it, taking a comic beat for it as well, to show, to almost highlighting, this is kind of,
Isn't this
this is kind of
ironic? Yeah,
ridiculous.
that's
Yeah,
kind of what we
but
do
then-
for our grandparents, though, isn't it? If our grandparents say something a little bit, off color or inappropriate, something you shouldn't
Yeah.
really say anymore, we all
Yeah.
go, well, they're old, they're from a different time or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
And
my
he's
nan.
even counting his heart medication pills
Yeah,
while
yeah,
he's saying
just
that,
to accentuate the fact that he's old, and if that's a truthful verbatim conversation, then it is funny that he's an old man counting pills who then rails against the communists. But yeah, certainly if it was being written or exaggerated, say, for comic effect, that's a good what's the word I'm looking for? It just supports the joke.
Yeah, but I think again that's a generational. One of the big themes of the book, I think, is generational gaps, and it does kind of link back to that problem with Apu thing I was kind of mentioning, is that he highlights when his father says that, because the very exclamation "he was a communist" seems absurd to Artie. Right? He seemed like, as we're saying, it's kind of a ridiculous thing for Vladik to say, but to Vladik, it's completely serious, right? Like he's not trying to make a joke here, but it's this generational change, old world, new world kind of jump between them, where like being a communist to Vladik is an incredibly serious thing. Meanwhile, Spiegelman himself was a hippie, left-wing, alternative, pot smoking,
Artist,
kind of guy. Yeah, and it was maybe not a communist, but more along those, that kind of.
Of that ilk,
Yeah. So it's, I think, it's another point of him highlighting. Not that his father is embarrassing necessarily, although I think it is part of that, but just that he's absurd in his own way.
Yeah.
Right, and
he is quite absurd in his hoarding, and he's like with him counting his pills very methodically, and we later on see him like separating up his nails into long and short ones. It's like that is kind of a strangely absurd thing to be spending your time on.
Yeah. Well, I think we wanted to keep this episode relatively shorter than our previous 2-hour epics. And we've done a pretty good conversation on here so far. Is there anything else about the book or about Vladik and Artie specifically that you wanted to highlight or bring up?
No, not really anything about the two of them. No, I think I've covered a lot of what I wanted to bring up. No, only really like an artistic observation, like a particular part of it that I really enjoyed, where it's fairly near the beginning of the book, I think it's in the 3rd chapter, Prisoner of War, where they are in a prison camp, like a work camp, and Vladik has a sort of a dream where his dead grandfather comes to him and almost gives him a prophecy that they'll be free on this particular day in the Jewish calendar. What does they call it? Parshas Truma, which is a Parshas is when they would get together and read from the Torah every week. But then on one week of the year, this particular one is the Parshas Truma. And the grandfather in his dream says, "You'll walk out of here free on Parshas Truma." And it turns out to be true. But or it seems to come to fruition. But it's just that the panel, the artwork on that panel, really like struck me of Vladek sleeping, and then this embodiment of his grandfather, almost in terms of scale. He's like
this looming figure.
He's looming.
Right?
He's huge in comparison, and a big hand comes down over Vladek's chest, and it's just very, very striking, and something about the way it's drawn gives it a very dreamlike scope, even though the artwork in this never goes very abstract. This is probably the most abstract moment that I can remember in it, but I just wanted to shout out that panel because I thought that was really cool.
Just what a book in general. Like
it's great. It made me think, because I did watch Jojo Rabbit recently, and it drew another comparison in my mind in that both Mouse and Jojo Rabbit are kind of depicting some truth, especially in Mouse's case, depicting truth about this horrific time in history in a medium that you wouldn't normally expect to find heavy-hitting historical commentary. So a Taika Waititi film we're expecting to be funny and weird and quirky, which it is, but then it doesn't shy away from the harsh stuff. And so you maybe you go into it thinking it's going to be a fun romp about an imaginary Hitler, and which is actually kind of a small part of the film, and the truth of of history is actually the main crux of it. And similarly to Mouse, where you don't expect to read a comic book about anthropomorphized animal-human hybrids to be very affecting and moving, and to kind of open your eyes to facts of history that people would maybe rather not read about and rather forget.
Yeah, and this kind of leads us into our next segment, which is the how much of it do you see, how much of you and your father do you see in this moment? But as a final point, I think the genius of making it a biography rather than just a well-researched novelization, essentially, is what sets this book apart from everything else, from every other kind of competitor that the Mouse may have, because it's so personal, and even going to the point of talking about his mother's suicide, which takes place after the Holocaust, right? It's not connected in as a historical event that happened during the Holocaust. But the book doesn't hide away from the impact, the after effects, the generational trauma, which is a big part of the book as well. Like, how has Spiegelman himself been affected by the trauma of his own parents? And one thing that we haven't brought up is the death of his older brother, who he never met, who would have been like more than 10 years older than Spiegelman. I think Spiegelman, maybe around 10 years. Spiegelman was born in 1948, I think. So his older brother was born in the late 30s.
Yeah, because he's young. He's still like 3 or 4 when they send him away at the beginning of the 40s. Yeah,
but Vladek talks about the son that he lost in the highest regard, and says how he was such a happy boy. It was such a shame that he died because he was such a happy boy. But he has an idealized version of the son that he lost, with a more strained relationship with the son that he has. And I think that's something that really comes across in the book. But yeah, let's get into the David, Brian. How much of your relationship with your father or father figures did you see within the first volume of Mouse so far?
This made me think about what you spoke about with The Shining, and we've had similar, found similar parallels in other things we've spoken about. But this is one where I felt the spotlight was not so much on, not so much on my father, but on me. Mm-hmm. Like I didn't see an awful lot of my father in Vladik, but then I did see bits of myself in Artie. And a bit like, again, with you in The Shining, they weren't necessarily good things. Artie makes a point when he's talking to his wife about differences that he had, like things that have always caused him and his dad to butt heads. I think in Mouse, it's that Artie always hated doing, like, fixing stuff around the house with his dad, because his dad made a point of pointing out how he was doing everything wrong, and how he himself, Vladik, was really good at this stuff and Artie wasn't, and that maybe was a reason why Artie went into the arts, because there was nothing he couldn't. His dad couldn't compete with him on that. He would be completely independent of him. And yeah, so there's parts of that I could relate to, and in the kind of the way that Artie is quite dismissive or completely ignores combative conversations. When ever his dad or his stepmom starts to complain about the other, he's not interested in engaging with that. He's not interested in, like, listening to them talk or offering them any advice. He's kind of just, I think when he talks to his stepmom once, he kind of maybe offers a couple of monosyllabic retorts, but he was really not interested in sitting down and talking about that. He's only interested in talking about what he's interested in. And I see that in myself sometimes, in my own kind of like inability to deal with emotional conversations or conflict. And it did kind of shine a light on me in a way that I haven't really felt in reading a book since I read Catcher in the Rye. And I remember reading the whole book thinking Holden, or whatever the main character's name, mm-hmm. really not liking him, like disliking all of his decisions and all of his elitism, and how
dick.
He's such a dick. And I got to the end of the book, and he gets a bit more three-dimensional, and you see a bit more of the truth of him, and suddenly I was like, oh, I get him now, and he's kind of like me. Mm. So and that was kind of that kind of put me in my place, and as not to such an extent in Mouse, but yeah, I felt a little bit put in my place of seeing a character who I was judging for his behavior, but then also empathizing with him in the same way, at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's what makes these books classics, right? And what allows them to live on is having those kinds of connections. Yeah. I think for my part, I don't see either of my father figures in that relationship. And I think part of that, again, is because the book is so focused around generational differences. I don't think, at least within my family, there is that much of an ideological difference between our generations, between my generation and my father and my stepfather. I've noticed more of them recently than I thought there were before, but there aren't many issues that come up where I'm like, oh, we just have a completely different view of the world. The bigger connection, I think, is between my father and my grandfather, which would be Spiegelman's a few years younger than my grandfather, I think. 8 years younger than my grandfather. But Spiegelman seems much closer to my dad than he does my granddad, generationally. And I think my granddad is reasonably close to Vladik in his generational outlook and behaviors. And I think part of that is those people who lived through the war and whose early lives were so heavily influenced by the war. Because one of the things I talk about with my grandfather is him living outside of London and watching the V2 rockets fly over his head as they're they're going to land in during the Blitz.
Wow.
And, all those memories of ration books and the Italian prisoner of war camp that was, just down the street, my great-grandmother flirting with Italian prisoners of war, and this kind of stuff. And then there's the generation that comes after the war who didn't live through it, who didn't feel its effects, and who would go on to either fight in Vietnam or protest against fighting in Vietnam, which their parents' generation couldn't understand. Because they'd been through the war, through World War II, they'd served their country, they'd done their time, and now their children's generation doesn't want to go and fight. Like, we did our part. What the fuck are you doing? Saying peace and love, man. What's that all about? And I think Spiegelman, although he was only born 8 years after my father, is much more in line with my dad, who was born in 1965. Yeah. Right, like almost 20 years later. Whereas my grandfather is much more in line with Vladik, who was born in like 1918 or something. And my
1902, I think, or something like that. Like, he was quite a bit older.
Yeah. I think Mala, I think, was born a little bit later. But yeah, it's those generational differences are very clear, at least as I see them in my family, between my father and my grandfather, where my grandfather is that kind of person who will keep everything, because you never know when it's going to be useful. Right? There's a bit I think where he's like, take some wire with you. You'll always find a use for wire.
Yeah, he just picks up
like
off the floor.
Yeah, the Vladik says. Yeah, and Artie's like, I don't want wire, but that's exactly what my granddad would do. My granddad would be like, I got some spare wire. Do you want? Why would I possibly need wire? But my granddad, and exactly the same as Vladik. My granddad is the house they live in is like 150, 200 years old. And at 75, he would climb up onto the roof and clear out the drain pipes. And it's like, you're 75, you're going to slip off and you're going to kill yourself. But he refused not to do it. Like, that's just who he was. And he's 80 years old, in great shape. Not that he like does sit-ups or press-ups or anything, but that's just that generation who grew up, that was his normal. And that's not who my dad is at all. So me and my dad are much more in line and much closer than he is with his dad. And that's something I see within that book. Like, I can't imagine a situation where me and my dad are that different, unless well, no, I can't think, unless he did something really terrible. But,
which of course he wouldn't.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting that you brought that up, actually, because I hadn't thought about that, but I can see something in Artie being my dad and Vladik being his dad, because my granddad was an engineer and was very much a hands-on. He could have built a bunker during the Holocaust to shield fleeing Jews. Yeah. He was that kind of guy who could build anything, make anything. He could do electricals. He could do brickwork. He could do he was just one of those men who didn't ever pay anyone to do anything because he could do it all himself. Whereas my dad, at least after I was born and throughout my childhood, he would do bits and bobs, but then as I got older, and I suppose we got more financially comfortable, he would always be the sort of person to be like, why do it?
Why would I do the plumbing?
Why would I do that? Let's just get someone in who can do it properly. So I suppose that there's an element of comfortability financially, but now that he lives out in the country, he's kind of reverted the other way, and they have like 10-foot hedges all around their garden, and he'll go out and do them himself over the course of a weekend because there's so much of it, and he has to like climb up a ladder and hold a big hedge trimmer above his head, despite the fact he has got a dodgy shoulder which gives him pain every single day. And we all say, Dad, like, not only is you've got a bad shoulder, you probably shouldn't be doing this. Also, you're up on a ladder on your own in a huge garden. What if you fall and broke your back and there's no one around who's going to be able to help you? Mum's not going to be able to see you. Mum's not going to be able to hear you. Just pay someone to do it properly. And he's like, well, no, I think I'd rather rather do it myself. So he's kind of swung the other way, where he's entering semi-retirement, and now he wants to do everything for himself again.
Yeah, that's something similar I see with my dad as well. I went down to stay with him a few weeks ago. He said, oh, there's a rattling noise in the radiator. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the radiator off the wall. We're going to drain the radiator. We're going to flush it through, and we're going to do all... And I was like, okay. so we did all of those things. He was like, okay, now when going through the whole process, got to be very careful when you turn this, because if we nudge that little screw too much, all the water's going to come hissing out. So just don't touch that, And it was this kind of a...
I'm very envious of men who just know that shit. It's just like this weird dad knowledge that comes out of thin air, where they just know how to bleed a radiator and know how to switch off the... I said really simple, like switch off the water and can change a fuse and all that stuff. I know why my dad knows how to do that stuff, because his dad was an engineer, but I'm still kind of in awe that it just seems to be a thing that all dads know how to do stuff around the house.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that generationally, knowledge that would be passed on from generations.
Yeah.
Like, give me a hand with this, and pay attention while you give me a hand with it, that you don't get once you start calling out your plumbers or your whatever, because you don't say, okay, now watch what the plumber's doing, so the next time you can take care of it on your own. It's knowledge that we lose. And another great example is knowing how to read a map.
Really?
Is knowing, right? Imagine you're out in the New Forest, right? Which is the forest outside Southampton. Yeah, and you've got an Ordnance Survey map. Your phone's dead, right? All you've got is your Ordnance Survey map. You don't know where you are. You've got to kind of guess using the map.
Yeah.
I would be able to use that map because I grew up before route maps were everywhere on your mobile phone, right? Before it was like, oh, I'll just follow this route planned out for me by Apple. But I don't know. I know very well that my ex-girlfriend now, we'll get onto that on the therapy podcast, would be absolutely stranded and would have no idea how to get back.
Yeah.
And imagine if you and Laura are out in the New Forest with an Ordnance Survey map. Do you think that you would be able to use the map? And do you think Laura would be able to use the map?
I think I would be able to use the map, but Laura could probably get us out without needing it, because she's got this weird inbuilt sonar compass thing, which means she can navigate her way out of anywhere. Like we went to Edinburgh a couple of years ago, and we walked all the way through the city all day, and then we used our phones for maps and stuff, and then the next day we were planning where to go, and I was like, okay, well, I'll get my map out. And she's like, no, we just go up there, do that, do left, go right, do there, and then we're there. I'm like, how the hell do you know that? She's like, because we walked near it yesterday. I was like, but how do you remember? She can just do that. But yeah, say we were blindfolded and dropped in the middle of the forest. I think I would do better with the map, but I mean, I couldn't figure out where I was with a compass and like the position of the fucking sun or anything.
Yeah. And again, I think that's because clubs like groups like Scouts or that kind of thing were more popular 20 years ago when we were kids.
Yeah.
And when it's like, if you want to drive to France, you've got to be able to use your A to Z roadmap in the back of the car. There's no sat nav or anything like that. But like, my brother is that much younger than me, is 8 years younger than me. I don't know if you'd be able to give him an Ordnance Survey map and he'd be able to do it. But that was generational knowledge that was passed down to me that I think is lost with the advent of Wi-Fi and 3G, 4G.
Yeah, and being able to go on Google and find what do they call them? Plumbers and electricians and all that.
Yeah.
They're there at the click of a button, and we'd rather, because it's convenient, we'd all rather now pay to have someone just come out and do it and then figure it out for ourselves.
Yeah. See, now we're becoming old men.
Oh,
Next episode of the podcast, How to Do Plumbing with Dave and Dom. That's going to be our next one. Okay, I think that's a good place to start the conversation for today. Have you got any final thoughts? Anything you want to bring up? Any ideas for next week?
You know what? I did have one, and I've forgotten it.
Well, you're doing the editing, so you can remember it, and then you can put it back in at the end and pretend that you knew all along.
Yeah, just like a little extra added on bit. Yeah, which sounds
Yeah.
completely different for some reason.
Yeah, because you can't be bothered to set up your microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just do it on my phone. It'll be fine. Okay, well, in that case, thank you everyone for listening to this episode. A little bit shorter, but longer than I thought it was going to be. Actually, it was a cool, in-depth conversation, I think.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. It
Really
was
happy
great.
with that. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Daddy Issues. Bye.
See ya.